Welcome, everyone. Good timing to this evening's lecture, which is being hosted by LSE Ideas. My name's Peter Tribowitz. I don't have anything to do with LSE Ideas. I'm a professor, though, in international relations in the International Relations Department and director of the Failing United States Center here at the school, which is co-hosting this event. It's often said that no bilateral relationship is more important in world politics than the one between the United States and China, and of course it's easy to understand why. And given their outsized power, huge markets, what they do, what they say, how they behave, it matters. It matters greatly to countries who depend on them strategically, economically, diplomatically, and perhaps nowhere is this clearer or states more cross-pressured by this dynamic relationship than in Southeast Asia, where countries have long-standing involvement with both superpowers, and where Beijing and Washington have not been, how should we put it, shy about expressing their preferences regarding policy alignment. This is really a fascinating phenomena that has been unfolding for 2 decades, perhaps more in, kind of in a faster pace in the last decade or so, but it's been going on for some time. And we have with us tonight a leading expert on the geopolitics of the region to help us understand what's going on today, the direction of travel, and where things are likely to move in the future. Professor Khong Yuen Foong. Professor Khong is the Li Kong Shing Professor in Political Science and the co-director of the Center on Asia and Globalization at the National University of Singapore. Before taking up his current position, we were just talking about his history, his trajectory, which I knew much of, but not all of. Before that, Yuen was a professor of international relations and a professorial fellow at Nuffield College at Oxford University, and before that, an assistant and an associate professor of government at Harvard University, and before that, a PhD student at Harvard. That's where he got his PhD. Yuen has written widely on topics that range from U.S. foreign policy, that's a lot of what he taught when he was at Oxford, to the geopolitics or the politics of the Asia Pacific, to cognitive approaches to international relations and foreign policies. The author of the award-winning Analogies at War, Munich, Dien Bien Phu, and the Vietnam Decisions that came out with Princeton University Press. Other notable publications along the way, there are many, include Power as Prestige in World Politics, which appeared in International Affairs, The American Tributary System, which appeared in the Chinese Journal of International Politics, and the United States Response to China's Rise, which was published in the journal International Security. This is not the first time that Yuen has spoken at LSE, but it gives me really great pleasure to welcome him back to the school on this occasion. It's great to have you here. For those of you, I guess what we're going to do here, are we online as well? Oh, everything is in person. Okay. So I should have known that, but as you can see, I didn't. When it comes time to Q&A, Yuen will speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and at that point, I'll take questions. Just raise your hand. I'll try to get in as many questions as possible before we finish up here. If you haven't already, please put your mobile phone on silent. And with that, please join me in giving Professor Yuen Foong a very warm LSE welcome.
Thank you.
Is that good?
Yeah, you can hear me? All right. Thanks so much, Peter, for that very generous introduction and for helping set the talk in context. And I'm really delighted to be here this evening to share some thoughts on the topic that is probably very much on our minds, namely the return of great power rivalry and its implications for the strategic alignments of the 10 Southeast Asian countries. I mean, I have teased you with the earlier map of what the alignment scores are like of the 10 Southeast Asian countries, and I will actually share the website with you later on in the talk. Right now, there's never a dull day for those of us who follow these matters. Exactly a week ago, China announced new restrictions on the export of rare earth minerals, including magnets containing minuscule amounts of these minerals. And in response, President Trump said he will raise tariffs for goods from China by 100% by early November if China goes ahead with these new restrictions. Why did China do what it did? And how is this particular episode of great power rivalry, in some sense, a test of who is more vulnerable to supply chains disruptions on what, right? How is this likely to end? We can discuss this later, but you'll agree with me that this tit-for-tat behavior has become increasingly common in the last decade or so. It is a symptom of the return of great power rivalry, or what I would call power translation politics in particular. More on this later. Okay. Now, living in Southeast Asia, I sense a certain strategic unease among the region's leaders and opinion makers these days, actually for the last 10, 15 years. An unease, I believe, that is widely shared actually beyond Southeast Asia. But in Southeast Asia, this feeling that we are being sandwiched between two superpowers, the US and China, engaged in extreme competition, to use Joe Biden's words, is rather palpable. This discomfort is best seen in the discourse about not wanting to choose between China and the US, as these statements by Lee Hsien Loong, Lawrence Wong, and Scott Morrison indicate. Scott Morrison, you might also say, spoke too soon, because in 2020 he had to do an about face, that is, he chose decisively to align Australia with the US, all right, because of his suggestion on the necessity of holding an international inquiry on the origins of the COVID-19 virus, right? And that evoked a neuralgic and trade sanctioning response from China. Luckily these days, Australia-China relations have improved significantly with the new government of Anthony Albanese. I think there are 4 interesting questions we can ask about this strategic unease or dilemma. First, what is driving this discourse of not wanting to choose? Second, whatever the Southeast Asian countries say about their not wanting to choose, you, like me, are probably curious about who is where today in terms of their leanings or alignments vis-a-vis the two powers. Third, what explains their alignment postures or movements over time? And finally, what are the implications? My answers to these questions are based on a 5-year project called The Anatomy of Choice, Southeast Asia Between the Superpowers, that was funded by a Singapore Social Science Research Council grant, for which I was the principal investigator, with Professor Joseph Liao as the co-PI. Professor Liao, I suspect, is known to some of you here. He was an LSE PhD 2003 who worked with the late Michael Leifer, and of yesterday, the new dean of my school, in other words, my new boss. For our project, we invited 10 younger experts on Southeast Asia's international relations to write on each of the countries, on the alignment postures of the countries. And parallelly, we also worked together with another team to create what we call an alignment index, to to track the movements of the 10 countries. By alignment, we mean a form of structured collaboration between states on issues of mutual concern. So let's plunge straight into the first question. Why all this talk and worries about, choosing? The straightforward answer is that there is palpable US and Chinese pressure on the uncommitted nations to take sides. And the reason why the superpowers are doing this is because they are engaged in a titanic struggle for hegemony in Asia. Now, what do I mean? This quip by anonymous US intelligence officials is quite telling. They let on that Chinese leaders see the US-led world order as constraining China's rise and are attempting to reshape the world order to better suit Chinese preferences and growing clout. This is a rather perceptive take on China's ambitions. And for students of international relations, like many of you here, I think quite natural. Any power with China's might, scale, size, and talent would want to change things to suit its preferences when it has the clout to do so, right? So how do things look when it comes to China's clout? According to the Lowy Institute of Sydney, their Asia Power Index, the distribution of power in Asia looks something like this. This index, which to me is probably one of the best out there, puts the US as the most powerful country in Asia, score of 82 out of 100, followed closely by China, 73. China's comprehensive power in Asia, if you believe this index, is approximating that of America's, almost 90%. And the index calls the two of them the two superpowers of Asia. India, Japan, Australia, and South Korea have scores in the 30s, right? But that is a considerable gap between them and the two top dogs. And the significance of this index, I think, is twofold. First, in contrast to what many politicians and analysts say, Asia today is not multipolar. It is bipolar, with the US and China heads and shoulders above the others in comprehensive power terms, though the US remains the region's hegemon or predominant power. Second, China's overall power still lags behind that of the US, but it is closing in. The fact that China is closing in has led analysts to characterize their US-China interactions as great power competition. And it is probably the most popular generic description, and that is not incorrect. But what kind of great power competition, one might ask? For those of you who do IR theory, you probably agree with me that there's no consensus among scholars on this issue. There are two dominant perspectives that have been used to describe and explain the US-China competition, and they are depicted in this slide. The first is the security dilemma perspective, what I call SD in brief, and the second is power transition, or PT. Now, while some of the most prominent IR scholars have privileged SD, others use PT to investigate the dynamics, still others have mixed or conflated the two in the characterization of US-China relations. The reason why IR scholars have conflated the two is because it's very difficult actually to distinguish between their observable outcomes. They're quite similar, whether it's a SD or PT. What you'll see is competitive arming or arms spirals. And if we cannot distinguish between the two logics by observing outcomes, i.e. their competitive arming and competition, where should we look? We suggest looking at the things illustrated in this slide, their speech acts, their understandings of their structural positions, and their actions. We argue that the observable implications of the two perspectives are different, and this is how they differ, as we try to put it in this slide. The SD lens focuses on anarchy, uncertainty, and benign intent, whereas power transition people usually associate it with hierarchy, certainty, and crucially, malign intentions, as indicated in the first 3 rows of the slide. So I think this is just, for those of you who are interested in the IR theory, but I think I'll skip the unintended consequences reassurance thing unless you want to talk about it later. All right. So we also hypothesize that the security SD focuses on the military dimensions of the competition and are hence narrower in scope compared to PT, which focuses on what we call full spectrum competition across the board, involving the military, the economic, technological, and cultural aspects. So for the PT theorists, the US-China competition is not the result of misunderstandings or misperceptions, like the SD people may argue, because it's not a matter of they're not knowing what the other side is up to. For the power transition theorists, they know only too well what the other side is up to, and they'll argue that the US knows that China is intent on displacing it in the long term as the regional hegemon in Asia, and China knows that the US will do everything in its power to maintain its hegemonic position in Asia. Okay. This schematic sketch focusing on US-China interactions between 1989 and 2025 suggests that PT dynamics have become increasingly prominent after 2017. I think the real transition came during the Trump 1.0 years when the US came to closure around 2018 on the nature of the Chinese challenge. Basically, the Trump administration decided that China was not, despite being integrated into the international political economy, not going to be transformed into a liberal democracy. And if that is not going to happen, the US has a very formidable adversary, on its hands. And the Biden administration's policies show strong continuities, treating China as a peer competitor. And in fact, I would say that it was more strategic and coherent, especially in corralling allies to engage in a full spectrum competition with China. So that's why we say it is PT dominant. Trump 2.0 is very much about not letting China be bigger than the US economically and stronger than the US militarily. Now, what is interesting about the PT perspective is that things start to get interesting when the rising power's overall strength, according to those people who write about it, approaches 80% of the established power, of the established power's power. All right, you don't wait until parity or 100% before you start challenging or demanding changes. Right. So this is, of course, an approximate threshold. That is when the politics of power transition is triggered. And according to the Lowy Index, this threshold has been reached or breached, all right, and probably around the year 2017 or so, ever since they started doing the index. So it is a bipolar situation where the rising power, conscious of its new clout, will demand changes to existing arrangements and entitlements so that they better reflect its interests. The established power will have to decide whether to concede or to resist. China, however, denies that it is out to displace the US, saying, for example, that the Pacific Ocean is big enough for two, right? Graham Allison of the Thucydides trap fame wasn't too sure what to make of such denials, so he sought out and posed the question to Asia's most trenchant observer of China, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. I think this interview was probably done in about 2012. So Allison asked Mr. Lee point blank, does China aim to displace the US as the #1 power in Asia and the world? So Mr. Lee's reply was, of course, why not? They have transformed a poor society by an economic miracle to become the second largest economy in the world. The Chinese will want to share this century as co-equals with the US, and it is China's intention to be the greatest power. So that's Mr. Lee's answer. I agree with him. As I've suggested earlier, any state with China's size, scale, capabilities and achievements, would aspire to be the hegemon. Beijing's own frequent protestations against hegemonism notwithstanding, right? Indonesia would do the same if it had that power, right? But Mr. Lee's time frame, I would say, was probably too cautious. China is unlikely to wait until the next century to displace the US. I would settle for, say, 2050, right? Since 2049 is when China's rejuvenation is supposed to be accomplished. The extreme competition then is about being the top dog, because if you're the number one in Asia, you get to call the shots, make the rules of the game, and you have more room to shape the external environment to suit your economic and political interests. Note, however, that for now, according to Mr. Lee, China just wants co-equality. China knows that it is in no position to displace the US yet. For now, it should aim to amend the existing hierarchy of power and prestige by seeking co-equality with the US. China believes that the time has come for it to be recognized as the US's equal. In fact, if you look at what happened last week in terms of China's additional restrictions on rare minerals, it's very much about wanting co-equality. If you look at what the Chinese say in response, the Chinese argued that it was the US that started adding additional restrictions, so China was responding, tit for tat, all right? And at the end of it, the Chinese official says, what we are asking for is equal treatment. So that's actually quite revealing. And so there's this assumption, however, that it's basically China and the US are the two powers that should be shaping and providing regional order in Asia. And this also means no others need apply, right? The US, however, is not ready or prepared to grant China the co-equality that it demands. The refusal of the US to grant co-equality fuels the US-China competition. China is likely to create facts on the ground such that at some point in the medium future, the US will have no choice but to recognize China as an equal. Some of these facts on the ground, I would say, include air defense identification zones in Northeast Asia, ADIZs, all right, building military structures in the South China Sea, the AIIB, the BRI, the SCO, BRICS, BRIC, and RCEP. All right. Now, and the US is responding by asking its allies not to participate in these projects because they only serve to increase China's clout, such as Obama asking Britain not to join the AIIB. All right. But David Cameron neglected that advice, and Britain joined as a founding member and got a seat as a vice president, of the AIIB. So in China, the US has found its most formidable challenger. The US-China competition is likely to become more intense and dangerous than the US-Soviet rivalry during the Cold War, in my view. Unlike the Soviet Union, which was an economic laggard, China is a much more formidable peer competitor along all the relevant dimensions of power. And there are flashpoints aplenty, right? Taiwan, South China Sea, North Korea. So this brings us back to Thucydides' observation about the rise of Athens' power and the fear that it created in Sparta, causing the Peloponnesian Wars. China's power and the fear that it is causing in the US whether it will result in a great power war, it's very, very hard to say, right? But the struggle for hegemony between them is probably the most daunting geopolitical challenge of the century. What are the implications for the states of the region as the rivalry intensifies? Each great power, I would say, will want to get as many countries on its side as it can. A big part of international politics is about winning friends and influencing people. And by having them on your side, or broadly aligned with your interests, you have a better chance of calling the shots. On the military security side, two of the Southeast Asian countries, Thailand and the Philippines, are formal treaty allies of the US. Insofar as you consider such alliances important, you will want to keep them on your side. For China, if it wants to be the hegemon of Asia, it must first and foremost get Southeast Asia to accede to its leadership. Also, for both the US and China, if you have Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia on your side, your prerogatives in the Straits of Malacca will be much easier to exercise. On the economic side, the ASEAN countries are poised to become the fourth largest economy in the world, in 2030 or something like that, which means that they'll be just behind the EU. And ASEAN has been the source of many of Asia's regional cooperation schemes, from the TPP to the RCEP and so on. And this helps, to have to be associated with this kind of small to middle powers. So those are some of the stakes for the US and China. What about Southeast Asia? Why does it matter who they lean toward or align with? For some, namely those with alliance treaties or strong security ties with the US, it might mean the difference between security and insecurity. They would like to continue to maintain those ties in the belief that US military power projection in their region is conducive to peace and stability. Secondly, it might mean the difference between being rich or poor. Those who sided with the US and the West during the Cold War generally prospered because of access to investments and markets, while those who sided with the Soviet Union and China experienced much more lethargic growth. Related to this issue of wealth and prosperity is also the issue of regime survival. The political legitimacy of most governments in Southeast Asia depend on delivering sustained economic growth. And leaders who intend to stay in power will need to know where their country's lunch is going to come from. During the Cold War, it was obvious that the Soviets were no match for the US and the West on economic provision. Today, however, many believe that China can give the US and the West a run for the money. So it is not surprising that many in Southeast Asia, if they have not chosen, would prefer not to choose because they want their cake and eat it too. They look at the US, the faraway power, for security provision, but to China for economic growth, trade, and investment. But both China and the US are taking an increasingly dim view of this, as you can see from this He Yafei quip. And it is in Southeast Asia that some of the key or most significant political diplomatic alignments are up for grabs. Yes, most of them say they want to be friends with both China and the US, but we need to probe deeper to go beyond their rhetoric and ask if they might be leaning closer to one side, even as they utter those words. So to find out, Joe and I identified 20 indicators across these 5 domains to track or to tap the Southeast Asia 10 countries' alignment movements over time. Each of the 5 domains are weighted equally, accounting for 20% of the country's alignment score. What is distinctive about this index, as we call it, is that we managed to collect data on each of the indicators over 30 years, from 1995 to 2024. And the main advantage of this is that it allows us to discern the direction of travel over time. And what did we find? Okay. Figure 1 here is a representation of how the 10 countries have positioned themselves if we average out their positions over the last 30 years, 1995 to 2024. 100 means you're completely aligned with the US, 0 with China. So for convenience sake, let's say 45 to 55 is the band, it's the hedging band, signifying those who have straddled the 2 superpowers, successfully, the hedges, you may call them, and who have managed to keep roughly equal strategic distance between themselves and the 2 superpowers. I think the first thing that this figure suggests is this. When Southeast Asian countries say they don't want to choose, it doesn't mean that they're all smack in the middle, i.e. of equal strategic distance from the two superpowers. As you can see, half of them are already more closely aligned with one or the other. So conclusion one, when Southeast Asia, and I would think many other countries too, say they don't want to choose, it doesn't mean that they're neutral in their alignment. What they seem to be saying is that they're comfortable where they are now, probably because it has served them well, and would prefer not to move too far from their current position unless circumstances change. Okay, now what we're going to do next is to split this 30-year time frame into two 15-year time frames or spots to get a more interesting direction of travel picture. Okay. So figure 2 maps and compares the alignments during the two periods. If you look at the black arrows first in this figure, this is what the scores look like in the first period from 1995 to 2009. So the Philippines and Indonesia are basically aligned with the US, 64, 56. Cambodia at 43, all right, and Vietnam at 41 also seem to feel greater strategic comfort with China, though not as strongly as Myanmar and Laos. In the middle are 4 countries, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, the hedgers or straddlers, the ones who seem to be doing quite well in balancing their relations between the two giants. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is to show the difference between the first period and the second period, which is 2010 to 2024. Look at what happens in the next 15 years and watch the black arrows as they move and they get yellow text. All right. First, look at ID and TH. That's Thailand and Indonesia. All right. So they both move left. Thailand and Indonesia show the most interesting change. For Thailand, 10 points to the left, and for Indonesia, 12 points to the left. In Indonesia's case, it's a qualitative change in the sense that it moved from being in the US camp to being just marginally in China's camp at 44. And we can get into the reasons for this later. Right? Second, look at the Philippines. Oops, sorry. All right. So the Philippines also moved leftward a little bit, perhaps as a result of Duterte's presidency, which was very pro-China and anti-US between 2016 and 2022. But at 60, it is still basically aligned with the US. Third, have a look at SG, MY, BN. All right, that's Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei. They also moved in China's direction, though not as much as Indonesia or Thailand. And for the case, and they are still within the hedging range, as if you as you can see from this. The next, have a look at Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is the only country that bucks the trend, moving slightly, away from China toward the US and settling in at 45. That means in a hedging position from formerly being, being aligned with China. If Trump officials have had access to these findings, they might have thought twice about slapping Vietnam with drastic tariffs back in April, right? Now, and then have a look at Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. All right, so they moved even further left. Okay, let me see. Let's do that one more time. Okay. Figure 1. Figure 2. All right, first, Thailand and Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore and Malaysia and Brunei, Vietnam, the Indo-Chinese countries. Okay. So if you compare the two periods, I think two observations jump out. First, there's a general leftward shift away from the US toward China for virtually all in Southeast Asia except Vietnam. But some shifts are major, some are minor. The second observation is that in the 1995 to 2009 period, the US and China did not really press the ASEAN countries to take sides because their geopolitical rivalry remained muted then. Post the global financial crisis, however, the US-China competition took off in earnest. So it was during the second period, I think, that we saw greater pressure being applied by the US and China on Southeast Asia. Okay, so Joe and I summarized our overall findings in a recent essay in Foreign Affairs, and our basic argument in this article is that Southeast Asia is starting to choose, and the direction of travel is in China's favor. Interestingly, Foreign Affairs shied away from publishing the figures I just shared with you, all right? But we love this picture of Southeast Asia strategically sandwiched between the blue and the red magnets. Magnets have become such an important feature of geopolitics these days, right? And I can't resist sharing with you the website, what we have done with the data underlying the figures that we just shared with you. We have used them to create a website that I think I advertised for those of you who came early. And this is our Anatomy of Choice Alignment Index website, which will allow you to dive deeper into our data, methodology, and empirical claims. It is meant for global public use, and we will be launching the website in late October. So here are some of the features that you might find interesting. First of all, on the time spans, if you look at the bottom, you can change the time span. So this, what you see in the figures here with Singapore at 51, is over the 30-year period. Right? That means Singapore is smack in the middle, so is Malaysia, and even Indonesia at 50. But if you were to just look at, you can change the time span. Let's say you want to look at the most recent 20 years. So the website will show that, things are slightly different. And if you just want to look at the last 10 years, this is what it looks like. And if you want all 30 years, just point at one of the countries. Oops. Sorry, if you click all three, and then you point at the country, let's say the Philippines, it will show you, it should show you your 30 years. Oops, why isn't showing? I don't know. All right, you click on it. So it will show you all what, it changes over the last 30 years. And so this is time spans. You can change the time spans, in other words, to look at the times you are interested in. Then there are the bar graph representations of where the countries are. And the most interesting one is the weighting. Because we have weighted each of the dimensions at 20%, you might think that, all right, economic ties doesn't deserve 20%, it deserves 30. All right, you can actually change it to, let's say, 30, and you lock it. And then you think that political diplomatic interactions also deserve 30, and you can change it to 30, and then you lock it and see what difference it makes. So, so in other words, you can change the weighting of the dimensions in order to get a picture that's closer to your view of what really matters in this kind of interactions. Our assumption is that if you change it within reasonable bounds, it wouldn't make that much of a difference in terms of the alignment. I mean, if you say that military security is 100%, then you see everybody moving into the US side, right? But then be reasonable. And then you can compare which countries are closer to whom on what dimensions. So here you compare Brunei with Cambodia, but if you and you see where they are similar in terms of closeness to US or China. If you change it to Singapore, if you compare Singapore and Cambodia, so you see the differences even greater. Singapore is much more. Singapore is at 71 in terms of military security interactions with the US. Cambodia is at 38. Right. So this is these are some of the fun parts, and you can go. We describe our methodology, and and our, ways of going about doing this in the website too. So the website is already operational. If you go to this, you can play with it, and you're very welcome to do that. Okay, so what the website sort of tracks the alignment moves, but does not explain them. So what explains the alignment moves? Here I draw from the findings of our 10 authors with a bit of my own ruminations thrown in. The key factors or variables that help us understand the alignments we claim are the following: domestic politics, thought mainly in terms of regime legitimation, perception of economic opportunities, security ties and estimation of US staying power, and geography. I'll just say a few words about each of these. Domestic politics. We found domestic politics to be a key factor in alignment choice. There are, however, several ways to think of domestic politics, but the one that featured most prominently was domestic politics in terms of regime legitimation and regime security. That is, enhancing the regime's or government's political legitimacy and hence its survival or longevity. And political legitimacy is obtained on the one hand by consecrating an ideological narrative, be it democracy, communism, multi-ethnic meritocracy, or the national security state. And that justifies the regime's rule, and on the other hand, by policy performance, right, such as delivering the expected economic goods or good growth. The ability to point to successful polities with similar political complexions is an important part of the legitimacy narrative. So if you're an authoritarian country in Southeast Asia, you might want to point to, there are authoritarian countries that do well too. Cambodia is the case in point. I don't have time to get into the specifics, all right, but I will be happy to elaborate a little bit on that if you want. The regime legitimation and the economic opportunity variables are intimately related. As it turns out, perceptions of economic opportunities feature prominently in all the countries. The standout fact here is that China has been the #1 trading partner for virtually everyone in Southeast Asia. And in that sense, there's a strong sense of how growing with China serves the national interest as well as secure political legitimacy. On the foreign investment front, China lags behind the US in several countries, but is catching up under the BRI projects. The case of Indonesia combines regime legitimation and economic opportunity in a very interesting way. The colleague who wrote the chapter on Indonesia, Evan Laxmana, focuses on the role of what he called veto players. While previously the military was the most significant veto player in Indonesia when it comes to relations with the US and China, his chapter argues that with the post the Suharto period, the rise of a pro-growth political elites and business groups, and by implication, the relative marginalization of the military, has led to these pro-growth groups becoming the more significant veto player. And they are not vetoing strengthening relations with China, because these groups tend to see China as an economic opportunity rather than an ideological threat. And that helps explain why Indonesia has moved leftward in China's direction. Now, it is unclear whether the election of Prabowo, a former general, may move the needle back in the US direction, but I think it is unlikely for now. Third factor, security ties and estimation of US staying power. The two are not the same, but for analytical convenience, we find it helpful to put them together, because if you have minimum security ties with the US, you don't worry too much about its staying power in East and Southeast Asia. The accent, however, is on estimation of staying power on the part of the US. Singapore and Vietnam have been the most explicit in voicing their concerns about US staying power. When Singapore says that the US is a benign hegemon, or that the US presence has been conducive to peace and security in East Asia, it is not only expressing a deeply held belief, but also a speech act that tells the US, please stick around. However, one should also say that Singapore these days have dropped the word benign from its description of the US. Finally, geography. The idea here is that your geographic location impacts on your alignment choice. If you share a border with China, like Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, with China atop you, you will feel the natural gravitational economic pull of China, though that may be balanced by historical suspicions or animosity, as in the case of Vietnam. Be that as it may, the geographic factor says, don't piss off your northern neighbor if you don't have to, right? And that helps explain why I think Myanmar, Laos, and to some extent Vietnam has traditionally been closer to China than the US. And that also tells us why Vietnam has been so cautious in inching toward the US, forming only a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US in 2023, which is 15 years after they have had that relationship with China. All right. Now, despite Southeast Asia's apprehensiveness about the rivalry and about making the wrong choice, there has been an economic silver lining for some, at least until before Trump 2.0. You've probably seen media declarations about the winner of the US-China trade war in Southeast Asia. Anyone? Who won the US-China trade war? Vietnam, exactly. All right. Vietnam has often been hailed as the chief beneficiary of the China Plus One strategy, where the US and Western multinationals set up plants outside of China, right, in order to mitigate the effects of trade sanctions on Chinese exports, friendshoring, and de-risking or rendering more secure their supply chains. There are some examples. I think I'll skip the examples in the interest of saving time. So let me conclude then by mentioning some of the policy implications of these findings. First, absent from our account of Southeast Asia's alignment patterns is the position of ASEAN, the regional organization. This is because there's no one ASEAN position on the issue. When it comes to their alignment moves, the story is more one of heterogeneity, the interests of each of the Southeast Asian countries, which makes it very hard for them to take a common position. A second implication is that while the direction of travel is clear, roughly half of the alignment postures, and they are of the key countries, are actually quite fluid in the sense that future actions of China and the US matter. If China sinks a few Filipino ships to get control of a disputed island or two, it may cause the hedges to reconsider their positions, right? Third implication, not all of the Southeast Asian countries strategize or calibrate their moves in the way that Singapore, Vietnam, or perhaps Malaysia seem to do. For countries like Myanmar and Laos, geography and regime type impose severe constraints on how far they can distance themselves from China, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, the Philippine deep state is congenitally attached to the US. And the Indonesian example is very interesting because Evan Laxmana argues that Indonesia may be sleepwalking into China's orbit. Last but not least, our findings are based on data we have accumulated to late 2024, which means that they do not incorporate the actions and the policies of Trump 2.0. Now, by upending the assumptions underlying much of Southeast Asia's path to economic growth and prosperity, and by inflicting punishing tariffs on many in the region, the US is coming across as less benign, less reliable, rather coercive, and revisionist. Singapore has become much more vocal, speaking truth to power, you may say, about how the US is becoming a rent seeker, taking a narrower conception of its interests and more coercive. Vietnam, the one country in our index that has moved toward the US, is slapped with 20% tariffs, right? And for transshipment ones, 40%. Indonesia has joined the BRICS, among whose agenda is to defend against US weaponizing the dollar and SWIFT. Trump has threatened 100% tariffs for those who join BRICS, while Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand have also expressed interest in joining and are partners for the time being. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, well liked by the US in the past at least, his criticisms these days of US support for Israel in Gaza, his interest in joining BRICS, and his very strong engagement with China suggest that when we update the developments of 2025 to our index, we may see Malaysia edging closer to China compared to its current hedging position. So here's the parting thought. Is Southeast Asia the canary in the mine? That is, what we are seeing happening there in terms of the alignment movements, are they a harbinger of things to come in the global South, including countries in Latin America and Africa? I'll be curious what your thoughts are, on this one. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Yuen, that was terrific. You've put a lot on the table here. We probably have people already going to that website to mess around with it. Maybe I'll ask a question or two to just kind of kick things off, and then I'll start taking questions. One is just a simple empirical question about the model. So as I understand it, you've got these 5 different categories of of ties.
5 dimensions,
right?
yep.
So 5 dimensions: military security, diplomatic, political diplomatic, cultural. So this is a question less about kind of the weighting within these and more about kind of disaggregating. Like, what happens? I mean, do you get very different results if you do this measurement on kind of cultural soft power, let's say, and you throw out military and security? I guess what I'm trying to understand is, everything is in the hopper here, even though the amount of military security might vary a little bit, but what happens when you decompose it? Or just, for example, if you were to have a line for each one of these dimensions where you were comparing the Southeast Asian countries, do they pretty much map when you're talking about change over time? Is it pretty similar across the dimensions?
Okay.
Or does it vary? Anyway, it's an empirical question, but it would seem, my hunch is that we would see variation on these dimensions, but so that's one question. The second question is more about the first part of your talk and the connection between it and the second part of your talk. So the first part, you had a really nice table, and I actually, had the privilege of reading an earlier piece by you. I think we exchanged papers at one point on what you're calling SD and PT, security dilemma versus power transition. And, I wonder, when you're looking at basically, if we think about the last, I think it's 30 years that you had, the first 15, everybody's trying to get to the center. And then in the second 15, there's movement, for the most part, towards China. And, it would seem like maybe, there's just a question, to what extent, because you don't have this as one of the potential drivers here, to what extent is this really a function of a kind of system-level change of the U.S.-China relationship, moving from, the security dilemma, this is just one big misunderstanding, misperceptions on both sides, to something that is, there's no misunderstanding here, and this is pretty damn predatory at this point, right? And so that, and you know, the implication would be if you've got that kind of transition, that many of these countries, to the extent that this is right, are moving towards China because they're viewing the United States as too predatory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for your lovely questions, Peter. Okay, on the first one, in terms of variations in the specific indicators, in general, most of them tend to go together, right? I mean, they do seem to reinforce one another, but there are some that do not necessarily move in the same direction. Mm. So we see that as actually quite useful, because then it balances out, you know, the tension, right? So on your second question about the transition, right? So what we did in this paper, which was written with my research associate, it's an unpublished manuscript. So we look at, you know, a series of events in U.S.-China relations, and then we try to look at, you know, how they talk about one another, and then what kind of intentions they ascribe to the critical thing actually in this is the change in benign intentions to malign intentions. And we borrow here from a wonderful paper by Tang Shiping, who wrote a very good paper on what is the security dilemma about. To him, the major thing about, you know, once you have malign intentions, it's no longer a security dilemma. And so we borrowed that and we incorporated this into our narrative and say that, you know, if both sides think that their intentions are malign, then it's no longer a security dilemma. Because I know what you're up to and you know what I'm up to, and there's no misperception, right? Although, and then there'll be, and if there's no misperception, then I'm not so concerned about my unintended consequences when I take my actions. And reassurances are not going to be that important too, in a way that they are important in SD. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Okay, the floor is open.
Peter, I'll stand because, as you say, the seats are a bit low. You can't see everyone. If
I agree. These seats are way too low. It's very uncomfortable sitting up here. So stand. Hands. Anybody got a question? We'll start in the very back there. Right there. Last row.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself, your name, serial number, your name, and maybe the program you're in.
Hello, my name is Verissa. I'm currently in my third year of the BSc History and Politics here. And thank you very much for this elucidating talk. I was wondering, how do you see this, the role of these strategic alignments or the US-China rivalry playing a role in sort of border or territorial disputes and conflicts in Southeast Asia, since we've recently seen between Thailand and Cambodia or Indonesia and Malaysia?
Maybe I'll let you just go ahead. You want to just take this one?
Should I just take this one?
Yeah.
Okay. On Thailand and Cambodia, what is actually very interesting is that you can say that the US actually might have done more in stopping their recent, conflict than China. China, which aspires to be the regional leader, actually was very restrained, or did not actually do that much, maybe according to its principle of non-intervention, so to speak. Even though China is very friendly, or even though Cambodia and China seems to have so much so much more closely aligned with China. So China, maybe because of that, China did not do very much, and it was the US threat of more tariffs if you guys don't make peace that might have been more significant. But ASEAN, with Anwar Ibrahim as chair, tried to do, Malaysia did try to bring the two parties together, and so in a sense you can say that ASEAN played a role and Trump played a role in helping them at least, not pursue the conflict more intensely. On Indonesia and Malaysia, I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of territorial disputes, because they have, the one that we know about, they have subjected to the International Tribunal, and both have respected the ruling. Right? Are you thinking of a different territorial dispute? Ah.
Sorry, thank you. There might have been some threat of military movement.
Okay. Between Indonesia and Malaysia. Okay. I'm not aware of that. But at any rate, when we have things like that, that is when ASEAN is supposed to come into play. All right? Unless it gets to a very serious level where other external powers may, want to where ASEAN cannot do it anymore, then the US or China may, try to restrain the powers. But I'm not familiar with this particular incident.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Hands, other hands? Let's take this gentleman right here in the blue sweatshirt, LSE sweatshirt. The older students in the room, I see you.
Thank you, Professor. So I'm Philip Beckman. I'm doing the Master of Laws program here. I had a question. During the beginning of the COVID pandemic in sort of 2020, 2021, I felt that there was a widespread acceptance in the Chinese leadership that they perhaps underestimated the shift in the American position, or that they were too late to recognize how the Trump administration shifted the political position of both the Republican Party but also Congress and the Democrats. Do you see a similar delay in the in how the second Trump administration is viewed throughout Southeast Asia, or do you think that, similar to perhaps to the Chinese government now, all other governments were fairly prepared on how the Trump administration will approach the region, or would you say that some were surprised by some of the actions, particularly vis-à-vis Vietnam, for example?
While you think about that, I'm going to take another question in this round. I feel compelled, and I'll get into trouble if I don't, to have one of your former students put a question to you.
Robert.
Well, I have to. Lovely. Thank you. And lovely to see you again. In your explanations of the positioning of countries between China and the US, you made a significant amount about the geographical position. And I think that's intuitively right. Of course, the closer you are to China, the more you lean towards that country. But one thing I was missing is you didn't talk about the ethnic composition of those countries in Southeast Asia. And particularly the size of the ethnic Chinese population in them, and to what extent that might influence them. Mm-hmm. I remember I was in Singapore last year, and it was said to me that the Singaporean government might be more US friendly if it wasn't for the, shall we say, the emotional attachment of a large part of its population to their families and roots in China. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, to what extent do you see that play out across the region as well, and how that could become a much more potent force as the conflict intensifies? Thank you.
Okay, super sharp question, Robert.
Go ahead.
Okay. I didn't quite understand your question before I address Robert's question. Can you rephrase it slightly for me?
Thank you. So as I said, it was my impression, and you may have viewed it differently, that during the first Trump term, the Chinese government sort of underestimated how much Trump shifted US foreign policy doctrine, or to what extent he may have just been some iconoclastic figure. And so I was just wondering, with that in mind, do you think that Southeast Asia in general has been surprised by the second Trump administrations and their policies towards the region, or was that rather largely within what was expected? Because it seems to me that now the Chinese government was much more prepared for the Trump administration.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah,
Okay.
you maybe could just, fold that or connect that to the question about the staying power of the United States in the region. Yeah, good question. Go ahead.
All right,
We'll do it.
so I'll address that question first. My sense is that the leaders of Southeast Asia did not anticipate how sort of different Trump 2.0 would be, right? I mean, this upending of all the, rules and the ways that Southeast Asia has relied on to grow in the last 20, 30 years, I think no one expected that, they will be upended. I mean, basically the US sort of defecting from the international economic institutions that is set up after World War II, right, came as a big surprise, I think, to most in ASEAN. And it really affects their thinking about how are they going to grow, I mean, in the next 10 to 20 years. And that's why I think you see the discourse in Southeast Asia, the view of whether the US is still reliable, on these matters has become quite prominent. And of course, China is taking advantage of that situation, saying that and it's very interesting because in the last, even before Trump 2.0, when you sit down with American diplomats, usually they will say, we are not asking you to choose. But by the time you have lunch and you go to your second course, they will start criticizing China and saying that why aren't you guys taking a stronger position on the South China Sea or something of that sort? I mean, and then when you have lunch with the Chinese diplomats, it's slightly different. They'll say that we understand that you don't want to choose, but when the day comes, we are sure that you will be very rational about it, and you will probably pick to go with the wave of the future. All right, so that's the term I've come across quite a bit. Of course, the wave of the future is China from their perspective. But I think this is something that the Southeast Asian countries will have to mull through very, very carefully. And so the other thing is that there is a school of thought which says that Trump 2.0 may be an aberration. So the hope is that you may have something like an Obama or a Clinton coming back, not necessarily Biden, right? Because Biden continued the tariffs, that the Trump administration instituted. My own view is that I think the U.S. has fundamentally changed. Even after Trump 2.0, if you don't get a Vance, even if you get a Democrat, I think it'll be very, very hard to change those, institutional defections on the part of the U.S. Moreover, the psychology of the Southeast Asians and maybe much of the rest of the world as to the reliability of the U.S. In a sense, the U.S. may be tired of providing all the public goods that it has been providing. During the Cold War, you can understand why the U.S. might do that. But if the U.S. has come to the conclusion that, it's being a sucker by allowing all this free trade and all these things, it no longer suits the U.S., it's not unnatural that it would want to defect, even though it built those institutions. Robert, your question about about the ethnic issue. Yep. It is actually something that the countries in Southeast Asia are very aware of, right, and think about. And Singapore is concerned about it in a domestic political way, in the sense that if Singapore aligns itself too closely with China, the worry is that it may have an impact on the multi-ethnic character within Singapore. In the sense that Singapore is a Chinese majority country, right? Will the minorities feel insecure, right? And so I think the Singapore leadership is very aware of that, all right? Now, this is a different thing from in the past, when the worry was that if Singapore was too close to China, it would be perceived as a Chinese fifth column in Southeast Asia. I think that has receded. Now, one reason why it has receded is because of, if you look at of who has been moving in China's direction, Indonesia and Malaysia actually has moved more towards China than Singapore. And that raises a very interesting dilemma because Singapore was the last ASEAN country to establish diplomatic relations with China. And the argument was that, it did not want to be perceived by Malaysia and Indonesia as being a fifth column for China, right? So let Malaysia and Indonesia establish relations first, Singapore will come later, although Singapore always had very strong economic relations, even when they did not have diplomatic relations, trade, and so on. Now, so if in the next decade, you have Malaysia and Indonesia moving much closer to China than Singapore, technically it frees up Singapore to move closer to China, because apparently Malaysia and Indonesia doesn't think about China as an ideological threat anymore, right? Now, if Singapore finds itself in that position of freedom actually to move closer to China, will it want to, right? So that would be, I think, really interesting. And you're right, the ethnic factor come in. But things in Singapore are also changing. There's a generational change in Singapore. And while in the past, I think it was clear that Singapore should side with the US, the younger generation and the new Chinese immigrants are playing a role, in sort of the debate about how Singapore should, align itself in the years ahead.
Other hands, we'll take this gentleman right up here, and I'll come down in this direction.
Thank you. My name is Joseph, and I'm from China, so I probably have some pre-established assumption in terms of the relationship between China and the United States, as well as China's relations with ASEAN. So my question is actually related to the Philippines. So if we should continue the research into 2025, probably the index of Philippines could go further down into the orbit of the United States. And particularly the current administration of the Philippines is aligning very much closely with the American side, particularly in terms of the security issues. So my question is that to what degree does this kind of action worries the other 9 ASEAN countries, which basically are choosing to, which basically are in the hedging zone, and they're playing the game of balance between the 2 powers. To what extent does this kind of things worries them?
To what extent?
Does the action of the Philippine administration, the current Philippine administration, worries the other 9 countries, which could possibly introduce war into the region?
Okay.
Okay, let's take a woman over on the far end there.
Hi, my name is Rosemary, and I'm a master's student in international relations. So obviously, as you've shown here, we've seen a marginal or extensive push towards China. This is specifically for the countries that have disputes in the South China Sea or have other disputes with China. Do you think there's a limit to which their marginal push towards China will go, especially if they have these long-standing disputes with them? Or do you think that there is a possibility that in the future they could go so far towards China that those disputes are just moot, basically?
So you're asking the question with respect to those who have rival claims
Yes.
with China in the maritime area?
Specifically the countries on here that may have territorial disputes with China.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Julia, right here. In the gray.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I'm Dr. Giulia Sciorati from the Department of International Relations. I was really intrigued by the explanation that you gave for alignment, especially in terms of regime security. And given the broad spectrum of regime types in Southeast Asia, I was wondering whether you could share a bit more about different types of regimes maybe play a role in this story. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. On the question, I think there were, the first and second question, actually, they are related in terms of the maritime disputes, right? And whether you don't, what's ASEAN's attitude? Oh, all right, on ASEAN's attitude towards, let's say, the Philippines. I think we can just say that the Philippines feels rather lonely on this issue of lack of ASEAN support or solidarity in the Philippines dispute over Scarborough Shoal, or those isolates vis-a-vis China. ASEAN has been quite quiet and hasn't really thrown its support, with the Philippines on this issue. So it's almost like the ASEAN wish that this is something that will go away, because if you contrast the way the Philippines has been going about it with China compared to Malaysia, Malaysia takes a much more low-key approach for whatever reason. Malaysia claims that they negotiate with China very silently, all right, and they do not want to play up the issue. Where the Philippines, for whatever reason, especially under Bongbong Marcos, right, they have taken a much more strident position, right, in a way that Duterte never did. Now, Duterte always says that, what do you expect? We go to war against China, we have nothing that can fight the war. But Bongbong believes differently, strengthening his relationship with America. And you're right, in the update, you'll probably find Philippines inching 1 or 2 points, toward the U.S. But I think now Vietnam, which also have disputes with China on the maritime issues, is probably taking a position somewhere between the Philippines and Malaysia, right? But it does stop Vietnam from being wanting to be too aligned with China, because those disputes need to be settled. Although Vietnam has negotiated some solutions in the Gulf of Tonkin with China, so there's this notion that those can be negotiated. So there's a variation in practice, and I think from us or not from the ASEAN part, they wish that the Philippine-China thing will go away. Right? The Philippines' complaint is that you guys are not standing behind us on this one, and it's always a sore point. And on territorial disputes, so that's the Philippines and ASEAN. And your question is about regime type. Sorry. Regime type. Regime type. Okay. The regime type. I mean, the reason why countries like Cambodia, Myanmar and Laos feels a certain affinity with China is precisely because of regime type, right? And it matters in the sense that they have similar authoritarian governments, right? And so there's the political system similarity. But what is interesting about China is that China is is indifferent to a political complexion. It will deal with anyone. Right? But then if you're a Cambodia or a Myanmar, you will feel, I think, much closer, in that sense, politically. And of course, the US has sanctioned Cambodia and Myanmar. Right? So because of its human rights, problems, and with Cambodia having coups, same thing for Thailand. All right? After the coups in Thailand, all right, the US expressed displeasure, and that helped move the ties, closer, in China's direction. So all this, in a sense, actions of displeasure on the part of the U.S., criticizing the human rights record of all these, ASEAN countries that which are more authoritarian, that makes them insecure, regime insecurity, right? And in this case, you have during the Cold War, you didn't really have people to move to who were economically successful. But now there is an alternative, right? And China provides aid, provides a military, aid and economic aid to Cambodia, and Myanmar. So for all those reasons, they might feel safer with China.
Okay, John. In the back, in the white. Sure. And then we'll go from there to the gentleman in the blue sweatshirt.
John Seidel, a sort of aging, overstaying graduate student of Southeast Asia. Thanks for a fascinating talk. Two things that it left me wondering about, two kinds of questions. The first is, it seems to me the most interesting and important finding of all this is there in, in the continuities and also in the tendency to sort of hover around the median, right? With few exceptions, there's been very little change, and with few exceptions, it's all sort of revolving around, the 50-point mark. There doesn't seem to be a tipping point. There doesn't seem to be, sort of a pattern of polarization unfolding in any of these countries, with few exceptions. And that's unfolding during a period when there seem to be pressures, especially in the economic realm, for, win-lose, zero-sum kind of choices in terms of global supply chains and otherwise. And we're told that over the years ahead, with AI and otherwise, that there will be critical choices of a zero-sum nature to make. Whether it's in semiconductors or AI or automobiles or otherwise, or subsea, fiber optic cables. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if the conclusion we should draw from the past, especially if you look at the past periods in which there are economic junctures and pressures along these lines, is actually an optimistic one for Southeast Asia. That actually, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That actually, that Southeast Asia survives and manages in the face of these sorts of pressures. And there's lots of talk about choosing, blah, 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 but actually Southeast Asia manages quite neatly and nicely and impressively. And then here's the second question, it's rather different. Here in the UK, people tend to entirely forget about Japan for reasons which one might wonder about. They totally ignore Japan. There's no interest in Japan whatsoever, from what I can tell. But in Southeast Asia, Japan is incredibly important and arguably could and should be understood as a, shall we put it politely, a junior partner of the United States. And therefore various forms of Japanese power, maybe even South Korean power, certainly in the economic realm, could be seen as enfolded within a broader American umbrella, beginning with the American active encouragement of Japan to become part of Southeast Asia's economic landscape through the ADB, through war reparations and otherwise. So leaving aside, the high-speed rail projects, isn't Southeast Asia's entire transport infrastructure Japanese built for Japanese cars and Japanese automobiles that still prevail on the roads and the rail and the transit systems of the region? Isn't Japan still, despite its stagnation economically in recent decades? And if you were to factor this into your analysis, wouldn't things look very different? Okay. Wouldn't the weighting actually look very different in terms of the balance of influence between the U.S., if we include Japan as, shall we say, a junior partner of the U.S., and China?
So I think we have time for this one last question here, and then I'll let you take it home.
Okay. Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. My name is Freddy Øvstegård, postgrad student here at the IR department. My question is, do you see Southeast Asian countries engaging with China also to help them prepare for providing public goods in the region? Can that explain some of the shift from right to left? So referring to what some call the Kindleberger trap, right? Do they have actual strategies to overcome that trap and not only the Thucydides one? Thank you.
Okay, let me take up John's questions. I may have a slightly different interpretation from you, John, on whether the more things change, the more things look the same. Right? Because if you accept our 45 to 55 ban as hedging, it is true that we do have 3 or 4 countries that seem to have hedged pretty well, right? But what we are suggesting is that actually there have been pretty significant movements by the others, right? Half of ASEAN already, in a sense, have chosen more or less, and you do have the other half who are straddling, all right? But the direction of travel, all right, is in China's direction. So that's, so it is changing. We are trying to argue something fundamental is happening. So I would slightly disagree with you that things are still very much the same. And your point about Japan is a wonderful point. As I tried to show in this slide, which I did not display during the lecture, if you ask countries in ASEAN, how confident are you that country X will do the right thing to contribute to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance, you will see that in last year's Yusof Ishak Institute poll, Japan is the, other than ASEAN, the blue is ASEAN, Japan has the highest amount of trust, and after that is the EU. Right? In fact, the US lags behind, China lags behind. So if you ask the Southeast Asians, and in this particular poll, it's a group of elite opinion makers, right? So they are thinking about Japan. They're thinking about the EU. There is a role. They are searching for a third party that might come in, to help maybe mitigate things. But as a student of international politics, I have some doubts about how far that trying to bring in Japan and the EU can go, because in the end, they do not have the material power that the US and China has. So you've got to be very careful in trying to bring them in, because while on the soft power side, both Japan and the US, and even on the economic side, Japan has a very, very strong influence in Southeast Asia. But when push comes to shove, you got to know whether, if you are Southeast Asia, how much you can rely on them to, in a sense, stand up to either China or the US. So I think they need to tread very cautiously on this one. But there's no doubt that there's very good feelings, and are hoping that both Japan and the EU will play a larger role, just to make the place a bit more multipolar, so to speak. Your question, can you rephrase it for me in a sentence?
Well, I guess the main part is, do you see the Southeast Asian countries trying to cooperate with China to be making China more able to actually provide sort of regional goods? Yeah, I'm referring to like the Kindleberger trap with like you have a great power rising and not being able to provide those global public goods or regional goods with the US decline.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you for stating it so succinctly. There is a hope that China may be able to provide the public goods at a time when the US seem to be more reluctant to do so. Some of the countries in Southeast Asia look to the Asian financial crisis and argue that actually at that time, China did not devalue the yuan. And that was a sign that, China was willing to, think more sort of beyond its national interest, right? Because it would have hurt the Southeast Asian countries. And during COVID, China did donate vaccines and masks to some Southeast Asian countries. And some studies show that actually, that they were, that really helped in terms of perceptions of China, even in the Philippines, because the Philippines got, quite good donations from China on that front. Now, but then whether China is ready to provide public goods along in terms of market access, and not maybe restraining itself from so-called selling its overcapacity, manufacturers to Southeast Asia. So there is worry in Southeast Asia these days that if the US market is closed off to China, Chinese goods actually may all, flow to Southeast Asia. And because they are so competitive, it will wipe out a lot of Southeast Asian companies. So that one will be a little bit tougher to, square.
Well, that is an interesting topic just in and of itself, but we've reached the bewitching hour. Yuen, I want to thank you so much for sharing this really terrific work with all of us. Please join me in thanking Yuen.